You're listening to the Big Cast, your source for the latest in financial technology. Brought to you weekly by the Best Innovation Group, with your hosts, John Best and Glen Sarvati.
Welcome to another edition of the Big Cast. My name is Glen Sarvati on behalf of the Best Innovation Group, where we like to do cool things with financial technology. And today we're going to be speaking with Laura Gibson-Lamothe, the Executive Director of the Georgia Fintech Academy, who's going to be sharing her impressions from the recently completed Money 2020 Europe conference that took place in Amsterdam, and more broadly, getting into the overall landscape for fintech talent development, which is right up her alley of the things that she does at the Academy. You'll be hearing more about that in just one second. Before that, let me tell you, you can always find out more about the Best Innovation Group by checking out our website, big-fintech.com. You'll find all kinds of interesting things you can do to help move your product set forward through the services of the Best Innovation Group. And you can also track down a bunch of our old episodes on the media tab, as well as a blog that I wrote recently. Again, it's under media, and then there's a blog post tab that about all the goings on in interchange. The proposed settlement with merchants between Visa and MasterCard, and then what seems to be, at least for now, some degree of resolution with a lot of the state legislation going around interchange, particularly around assessing interchange on tax and tips. So you'll find that at the website, as I said. A couple of quick things before we jump into the interview. Reflecting on the passing of former Fed Chair, longtime Fed Chair, I should say, Alan Greenspan at the age of 100 this week, I was reading some of the coverage of this, learned something that if I knew this, I sure as heck had forgotten it. I thought this was really interesting. You know, we make such a habit, and when we look at the markets, everybody's kind of waiting on pins and needles for the press conference that comes at the end of every Federal Open Market Committee meeting as interest rates are set. I had not recalled that before 1994, which was relatively early and less than halfway into Greenspan's overall tenure, the Federal Open Market Committee did not even, much less did they do an actual press conference. They didn't even release a statement saying what they had decided. It was just up to the market to kind of read the tea leaves and just, kind of intuit where the rates were going, which I find pretty remarkable. And I mean, there's talk about Kevin Warsh kind of scaling back the amount of guidance that and foreshadowing that the Fed does. But I think if you compare it to that 1994 changeover, it's hard to imagine it would ever go that far back. So just, I don't know. That one just kind of dumbfounds me. I was also just looking back because of that, just reminding the level of stability we've seen at the Fed. Going one before Alan Greenspan, Paul Volcker took the chair in 1979. And to be honest, he's probably the first Fed chair that I remember. He presided over the board during the period of extreme inflation, extended inflation that took place, stagflation as they called it, in the early part of the 1980s. Volcker was inherited. He was appointed by Jimmy Carter and then inherited by Ronald Reagan. And the two really kind of got, kind of at cross purposes with each other. But at the end of the day, between the two kind of, sharing the role of playing bad guy, they kind of came out in a place that I think they were both pretty pleased with. And then Volcker was followed. I mean, we've only had very few since then. Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, and Ben Bernanke. And that's really it. The thing that I find particularly shocking, and when I went back and looked at it, Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, Powell, all of them served multiple terms, and all of them were reappointed to a term by a president from the party other than the one that put them in the job in the first place. I think that's a pretty impressive statement about stability of government and the fact that politics can and should be kept out of this to a great extent. The one example, or the one exception that proves the rule, Janet Yellen, who was not reappointed by Donald Trump. And again, people kind of forget this sometimes. Jerome Powell, who took all kinds of shots from Donald Trump, was actually one of the first appointments that Donald Trump made, which is pretty phenomenal to me. And we'll see what happens this time around, because pretty much by definition, when Kevin Warsh's term concludes, there will be a new president one way or the other in the office. The other thing that just popped up just as we were going to record this, the Bank of England has issued a new rule, a draft policy that regards their approach to governing stablecoin backing. The way I've been hearing it, and I'm not going to get into too much detail, I'm just going to provide some links. It's being portrayed in the coverage as a softening of their preliminary approach to it. They are allowing a maximum of 70% of any British pound backed stablecoins to be in short-term UK government debt, with the remainder sitting in central bank deposits. That's actually relaxing from what they said before, where it was more of a 60-40 rule. So we've been battling around this one ourselves in the US. This is a little bit further along. And it's interesting. I wouldn't say that we necessarily always approach things the same way, but compare contrast once clarity comes out and we see what happens in the U.S., how that compares. Other comments that have been made is it's almost entirely irrelevant, other than it puts a stake in the ground. We talked about this before. The level of stablecoins that are dollar backed is phenomenally high relative to all other currencies out there. Stablecoins that are backed at this point by the British pound are less than 0.5%. Kind of remarkable in my mind. If you just think about overall currencies, I think we're well over 90, if not 95%, backed in US dollars. Anyway, I've missed a couple of conferences recently, which at some point I got to get off the road. Didn't really choose to get off the road not to go to Amsterdam, but that's the way it goes. Fortunately, had a couple of good friends out there that were able to kind of get us clued in. So let's jump into a conversation with Laura, who can help us out.
Laura Gibson-Lamothe, thanks so much for joining us. It's been, I guess, a week or so now that you got back from Money 2020 Europe, and I had FOMO the whole time. But thanks for joining. I'd love to hear some of your impressions. I'm glad you're taking the time to do that. Laura is Executive Director, is that the correct title? Mm-hmm. At the Georgia Fintech Academy. A good friend of mine here in the Atlanta market, and we'll talk a bit about how the Georgia Fintech Academy fits into the broader picture too. But first off, how was it this year?
Yeah, it was incredible, Glenn. I am still recovering, to be honest. I thought, with the time, lag and having kind of just the adjustment to come back to the US, I would be able to, have a couple of naps and catch up. But I think just the energy and the excitement, the prep that went into, preparing for this event, all of it kind of contributed to really a real exciting and rewarding opportunity for me to be able to attend again at my fourth year attending this conference.
Oh, you've been over to the European one for 4 years. I knew you'd been there at least twice. And this was the first time, if I'm not mistaken. You typically are on the interviewee end of the microphone, but this time you really gathered a bunch of your own interviews as well for the Georgia Fintech podcast.
No, that's correct. My evolution with Money 2020 has started off with just attending in support of my technology leaders, working for some banks back in the day, to then participating in the Rise Up program, which is a program that recognizes women leaders across the industry and brings them together as a cohort. And I really enjoyed that community. And then it transformed into becoming press media. So I joined from the perspective of really trying to, capture some of the insights and conversations that I'm having more strategically, and with the intention of sharing it with my community, as you mentioned, with the Georgia Fintech Academy and our focus being on talent, which we'll talk about later. That's been the lens and the angle I've been having a lot of conversations with this go around. It was a tremendously rewarding experience to have conversations under the guise of press and get access to some behind the scenes views from the conference.
And I've already seen some of your clips. I know you'll be putting more of them on your podcast. We'll post some links to that as well. But you were certainly out and about, I know, as well. Why don't we just, for anybody who's not familiar, the Georgia Fintech Academy is an initiative of the University System of Georgia and the state of Georgia, correct? But why don't I let you take it? You've got the.
No, you did a great job, Glenn. You did a great job. It's a university system, so from the perspective of institutions within our remit, we have 25. It used to be 26. We had one merge, two merge.
I was going to ask. Yeah, I remember 26 too. You caught me off guard.
I know it's really been difficult to make sure I keep on track with what's going across the university system, but these are all publicly facing state governed and state aligned institutions. So from those that are listening in from UGA, University of Georgia, and Georgia Tech, and Georgia State, and others are all aligned underneath the USG, and so we offer, I like to say, curriculum as a service in the fintech discipline. We are helping and working behind the scenes with each of these institutions to offer a variety of different degrees and concentrations in the fintech discipline, while complementing that with some programming, obviously giving some real world experiential learning opportunities. Really kind of sets the tone for how we want to help usher students into their opportunities into the industry. And so we've built a robust program, and we've served almost over 13,000 students since 2019, and so it's been incredible to watch that continue to expand.
And I know, talent development is basically the core mission, and the whole idea is to provide ready talent to feed into the burgeoning ecosystem here in Georgia.
Yeah, if you think about, for a lot of folks, financial literacy kind of is a gateway into what we're talking about, but the educational component is really being able to translate and to be able to empower students to be comfortable to pursue not only technical roles, but we have some non-technical. We focus, product and marketing and other verticals that are very important and critical to this industry. A lot of students come in not knowing that there's this thing called fintech. And fintech, we could go deep into this, but it's not that old, which is kind of incredible, from the story of how we watched the ecosystem here in Atlanta grow, but just broader across the globe. The word fintech, doesn't proceed 20 years ago. So in my context for my career, a fintech was something I fell into. And for a lot of students that we have now coming out of the high schools, they already know they want to pursue a career in fintech. So it's a total evolution as far as the awareness, I think, of this particular segment.
I know this had been true. Are we still the only state here in Georgia with a program along these lines? I mean, we were unique at one point. Is anybody else kind
Yeah.
of followed suit?
No, so I think independent individual universities have started to catch on and offering a variety of different degrees or concentrations in fintech, but nothing that is cross institution, as large, as robust, as extensive from the suite of curricula that we're offering. And so I travel the globe. Obviously, we're talking about one instance, but I've had conversations globally about this. And there's a lot of folks that are really watching what we're doing in Georgia because there's no other model to really compare to.
And I mean, the same example of looking across the globe and kind of helping to spread the word. I mean, you're also very inclusive in the state because you mentioned the public institutions, but I know in my own interactions with the academy, I mean, you've involved the private universities, the Morehouses, the Mercer, people like that. So, I mean, it's a wonderful resource all across the board.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Glenn. Yeah, because our intention, we would love to offer everything curriculum, because of the way we're governed and accredited, is protected and kept within the system and the network. However, for a lot of our extracurricular activities, I call them, and some of the things that we're doing to really evangelize and spread the word about opportunities in this industry, as well as connect people to the network, is all open to any student from anywhere.
And that would be kind of, I'm thinking of, I think I forget if they're Monday nights, but during the school year, a lot of times there's almost weekly events where you have speakers from the industry on a
Yeah, pretty
virtual
much
basis,
Monday and
sometimes
Wednesdays. Yeah, you're correct. Monday and
that's a
Wednesday
lot.
nights.
So
Mhm.
people can tap into those from outside. So we can offer some links to those as well. But back to Money 2020. I mean, you've got the benefit of seeing both the US and the EU versions. How would you, I mean, is there a significant difference in the vibe, for lack of a better way of putting it?
Yeah. Oh, I've been saying the word vibe this whole event, so I'm glad you said vibe. I would honestly say every year I come back telling everyone how the vibe is truly different in Europe from the US. Now, first of all, imagine this. In the Money 2020 version always happens late fall after a flurry of industry events because fall is quite chaotic scheduling wise.
You're right.
It's
It's kind of
Vegas.
the headline attraction that comes at the
It
end.
is the headline attraction, and it's in Vegas, which, to be honest, a lot of folks, especially I would say my age and older have this fatigue when it comes to Vegas. You have the casinos, the cigarette smokes, clouds that you're trying to you know, funnel through. It's just a totally different environment in Amsterdam. I mean, honestly, it was like a parallel universe because you have obviously the same brands, companies, maybe a few others that we wouldn't commonly see in the U.S. But the atmosphere, the energy, the lighting, just being surrounded by nature and the canals and water, it's just a lot more open, I would say, and that openness gives a little bit of energy. It gives a little bit of excitement. Conversations are happening, differently physically because of that environment and the atmosphere that you're in. So psychologically, I think because of the atmosphere, it has a huge influence on how conversations are facilitated, how people engage and participate in this event in Europe versus Amsterdam. I will also say I looked at some of the numbers, a couple of weeks ago. They were reporting what they were tracking and targeting, I guess, for Money 2020 Europe. I saw just a few days ago 7,500 plus attendees, over 100, different countries represented at Money 2020 Europe. It's a lot more diverse in its attendance, whereas US is more domestically, I think, focused. It does
Hmm.
bring in some delegations from, different countries, but no major platform where those companies are represented, on the expo floor or in conversations as much as they are in Europe. And so those are some things that I think really differentiate the Europe show from the US one.
That's interesting. So, I mean, it's very sizable, it's somewhat smaller. I think the US is about 11 or 12,000.
Mhm.
But as you say, I mean, there's delegations, but I doubt very much we can point to 100 countries that are coming to the one in the US. It's also ironic to me because I always think of Europeans as the ones who are still heavier in the smoking category. So you're saying they've got the cleaner air, at least for the purpose of this conference.
Well, and Glenn, it's so funny because not to get too personal, I smoke a cigar every now and then, and
Now
I
we're
just
getting
I
into the
found
real details.
I
Great.
know, now we get into the real details. I found out that I guess there's some laws that have changed over there. Smoking in general is no longer being allowed or permitted during certain times and certain venues and spaces. It's so funny because I would also say this is almost a metaphor for how payments has evolved
Yeah.
US to Europe. So, in the US, we've adopted no smoking outside of public facilities,
Yeah,
you
you
know what I
gotta
mean?
get
Like outside
outside
of
some kind of
businesses.
radius. Right.
And so now they're starting to adopt that in Europe, and they're doing it in a big way where, from a cigar perspective, they're completely outlawing labeling. They're making all of the health, concerns or cautions be labeled mandatory on every single product that goes out there. And so they're making some changes to the regulation around smoking. But I just say that because I find it kind of a deja vu moment thinking about payments and some of the things that were, a focus years ago are now coming to the US, which I know we'll talk about here in a minute.
And I'm thinking, I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Ainsworth, one of our kind of regulars, kind of the Pied Piper of cigars in the credit union space, currently at Metallicus. I gotta warn him. I don't know how often he gets to Europe, but he may have to cut back on some of his after parties.
Exactly.
So, what about kind of the bank versus non-bank fintech balance between the two? Is that similar, or is there a decent bank presence? I mean, it's such a different banking environment when we've got 10,000 banks and credit unions here, and I mean, you go across all of Europe. I doubt you can get very far into the thousands.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I would say, the banks not as present or boldly present as
Okay.
the US show. The focus on a lot of the conversations we had, either on the stage where there were panels, where there were fintech bank partnerships. And this is where we're going to talk about kind of the lines blurring quite a bit. But I would say, not as much representation as, we would celebrate in the US. For example, in the US, one of the appeals for a lot of fintechs, and I would put people non-fintech in the service provider bucket to going to the event is that roster of banks. Like we would
Yeah.
always see a roster of banks. They were promoted, 60, 90. 180 days out from the show just to get more ticket sales. In the Europe show, it's a little bit softer, I don't and less aggressive, less, put in your face, and I'm sure that's intentional. In the conversations that I had with, different exhibitors, there would be, some folks that would come by, the booths, and they would do a demonstration, and I would listen in, and some of those could be, banks and some, financial service providers that were eager to kind of get an insight on, what's latest and greatest. But again, not something as heavily promoted and marketed as in the US.
I'm just thinking also, it goes both directions. Obviously, you have the banks in attendance here that are, ready potential clients for the fintechs, but then you've also got folks like Chase who make big presence on the exhibit hall floor too.
Yeah,
So
that's
you got
true.
it going both ways. What about the whole kind of notion of collaboration versus competition? I feel like we've gone a long way down the road here in the US where it's no longer a, zero sum game, dog eat dog, so only one's going to be left standing. Yeah, and it's much more, synergies and, ways to work together. Are you seeing that there? Or, I mean, is the vibe any different as far as the, if there's not that many banks there, the fintech's kind of going, yeah, this is our thing?
Yeah, I don't see as much of that competitive spirit and energy. I had that conversation with quite a few folks, when I was doing my interviews of several leaders across, the fintech kind of ecosystem that were attending. It makes me think your question kind of gives me a little bit of a reflection thinking about when I worked for a UK-based company, and I bought in this great idea about putting out some differentiators in our sales deck, and I was met with a little bit of pause from the leadership team. We don't necessarily wanna throw any other companies under the bus. I thought that was quite interesting because I
Yeah.
was raised with the idea of we do it better than anyone else, and we're going to continue to promote that in any marketing asset that we have, and their approach was different. I also see this in conversations though, because there's a little bit of like friendly competition. I've seen conversations real time between competitors on the stage and just walking around the expo hall. So it's a different environment, and I would say it's a different culture. I think if you took the culture that we have in the US, it is, as you mentioned, kind of dog eat dog world, and we're all kind of like fighting for that one spot. I would say the way they go about it is really different culturally in Europe.
I mean, the other obvious difference that comes to mind is on the regulatory side. And the thing I'm thinking of in particular right now is privacy. And you got GDPR and everything over there. Do you get a sense? Are they thinking about privacy, both whether it's being done to them as opposed to by them, things like that? Is it, is it seen as the same level of importance or
Mm.
greater importance than you're hearing in the US?
Well,
That's
I
I'm
think
assuming that that's got
no.
to be one of the hot topics.
It is a hot topic, but not as hot as you would think because it's always been a topic. For Europe, it's always privacy has always been a topic, and a matter of fact, like, it's always been your data. Can we use it? Has always been the mindset. Whereas in the US, it is a reactive afterthought type process, I think, for how technology has developed and has evolved in the US domestically. It's funny you mentioned, like, GDPR, and I remember maybe 20 years ago attending my first show that there was, folks on the stage talking about will GDPR come to the US? And I think about all of these other products that I've been responsible for putting out. And it's like, oh, we got to worry about Canada and their privacy, regulation. And there's just certain things that in the US we don't necessarily think about, but for this entire time, as there's been a huge boom in the fintech space, the entire, European hemisphere has always had privacy kind of top of mind. I think now maybe more transparency, conversations about what some of these new innovations mean from a privacy perspective. Of course, we're going to talk about AI because I think it just ramps up what needs to be protected, and it facilitates a totally different conversation because the intensity of what privacy really means and what trust really means is a little bit more expedited than what we've had to talk about in the past.
It occurs to me, I haven't heard, maybe this has all been going on and I just hadn't been paying attention. When we talk about the potential or the need to regulate AI, and you see about the idea that it needs to be regulated on a global basis, But given how far ahead on consumer privacy GDPR was from what we were doing in the States, was there much conversation on any kind of EU-wide initiatives around regulating and somehow putting guardrails around AI?
Yeah, so there's a couple of conversations that I had that made me wanna go home and do some more research. I mean, for one, like, and not to muddy your question with the introduction of stablecoin, but to
Ah,
me, they both go hand in hand, to be
sure.
honest, because, one is kind of an extension of and maybe a new payment rail facilitator, of money movement. The other, is being leveraged to help facilitate it through agent to agent interaction. And so you have these groups, these, policymakers, regulators at this show in Europe. Policy 20 is the conversation that I keep hearing. There's this
Policy 20.
Policy 20's here, and it's a consortium of policymakers, regulators. They're having these conversations globally, talking about what this means from a regulatory perspective. Policy and privacy is also a part of that conversation, but that's something that I have to kinda take back and look at a little bit deeper. But policy
I'm
20
with
is
you. Let's divide and conquer on that one. I'm
I
not
know.
familiar, and so is that an EU governmental body? Is it a quasi-governmental industry kind of
Yeah, I
consortium?
believe it's an EU, and I know they have there's a summit of some sort where Policy 20 has brought, people together for, an invite-only kinda conversation. I just don't know necessarily who makes up this group, but it looks like it's affiliated, with Money 2020, but it's a
Maybe
premier
that's who the 20,
invitation only.
maybe that's
Yeah,
where the
it's a
branding
premier
comes
invitation only regulatory, summit,
okay.
and they're focused on bringing, folks together. And at Money 2020, we were talking about, the fact that, cross-border payments satisfied or solved via stablecoin is facilitating that conversation in a unique way, where we're now having a lot more global interaction, I think, when it comes to regulation, more than ever. So, thinking about how we've innovated and how we've innovated domestically, internationally, Singapore, and I think a SWIFT and some other things. It's just like some of these things are happening in silos. And now people are having conversations at the forefront because I think for a long time, stablecoin was kind of like an idea. And now it's kind of like become a real thing. Like it's a real thing. People are putting a lot of investment, time, design, innovation, leadership alignment behind it. And the regulation seems to be kind of driving the innovation versus the other way around. Regulate and then or
Yeah.
innovate and then regulate.
I mean, that's a really interesting perspective. I hadn't really thought about it that way, that it's almost a forcing mechanism that, how do you not do something on a global level when the counterparties are gonna be in different jurisdictions and almost by definition, which gets back, I was gonna ask you about the interest in cross-border, but I think it, kind of part and parcel goes along with the stablecoin conversation right now. That makes sense.
So
Okay.
right before going to Money 2020, I wrote a brief article announcing or sharing, I guess, the announcement of Georgia, the country, and their announcement of their Tbilisi stablecoin, and how there's kind of a real cool story to tell about Georgia and Atlanta and what we've done from a stablecoin perspective. Obviously, we've talked about like the Genius Act and other things that have kind of moved the momentum from a stablecoin perspective. The conversation has shifted from cryptocurrency to stablecoin. Stablecoin is real, it's here, and we've done a lot of and made a lot of progress here in the state of Georgia that parallels what Georgia, the country, is doing in their efforts. So I called it the tale of two cities, the tale of two Georgias, and illustrating that prior to going to my 2020 Europe was amazing because I just kind of like reconfirmed or affirmed some of the things that I was thinking and seeing as parallels in real time, meeting some of the Georgian delegation that was out there at Money 2020 Europe.
I love that. I'll post a link to that piece. That's really, and I'm guessing. I mean, I remember at the very early stages, as you say, people didn't even know the phrase fintech, and in the early days of the Technology Association of Georgia having a fintech society, people literally thought it was tech from Finland. So,
Yeah,
so now I'm thinking, okay, this could be the first chance for you to have the Georgia Fintech Academy confused with the state. You may have a merger opportunity. Who knows?
that's true.
I'm going back to the whole workforce thing, which, is obviously the core to your mission. I'm curious, especially with everything going on in AI and whatnot, did you come back more or less optimistic, just with a different perspective in any way about what this means for the way both the prospects for the thousands of people coming through the program or what they need to do to be properly prepared?
Yeah, I would say just because of, the fact that I was already facilitating naturally some conversations with leaders about, some of these trends and themes that we're talking about. The underlying question has always been talent, and everyone is really optimistic, I would say, on the most part. I hear a lot of negative news in my role, in my job. Obviously, I have a lot of students that are applying for jobs. The market is just not what it used to be right now. And there's always this kind of curve that we have to navigate in regards to just the economy and other outside contributing factors to employment. But I will say I'm very optimistic. A lot of the conversations I had were really about like what can we continue to do to help develop the skills that are needed. And the skills that are needed aren't anything new. We keep talking about critical thinking skills, problem solving, communication. Unfortunately, some of that has been hit by the pandemic and students not having the ability to kind of exercise some of these muscles during the pandemic. So we're still dealing with some of that. But it all goes back to the basics. And I think now when I talk to a lot of leaders, they're thinking internally, how they can identify some efficiencies through leveraging AI. And a lot of these companies are. I think for a long time, I had thought, fintech, we're so heavily regulated. We're not using it for much outside of risk and fraud, prevention, which is where I was at for quite some time before coming into this role. And so the reality is we're using it. We're using it in many different ways to kind of address some low-hanging fruit, I like to call it, from a operational perspective in the fintech industry. What this means is some of that work is freed up capacity to focus on more strategic things. And I think the word level up is what I'm thinking about, and I'm now trying to formulate my next kind of article, but it's requiring us all to level up. Organizations have to level up. People within the organizations are going to have to level up. Our students are going to have to level up at a very interesting time, and I've been through this time before in my past where you have to kind of get creative. Back in my day, it was creating a website for myself when that was not very common. I had to create a portfolio demonstrating my, creative skills, but from a technology perspective, which was not as common. And so now our students are going to have to leverage AI to kind of sell themselves into an organization. They're going to have to like think about ways where they can add value off the bat. It's no longer on, I guess, the organization to, facilitate this extended onboarding period and nurture and develop early talent. They're looking for people that can contribute, for lack of a better word, day one.
Yeah,
And so
it's a really interesting analogy. I mean, the idea of like going back and creating your own website and things like that. I think that's a really good way. I mean, I am a big believer in the human in the loop, model to AI.
mhm.
And, one of my concerns, kind of what your point is like the places that AI can contribute could potentially be the same places that the more junior, just entering the workforce folks get the experience they need to move up. But I think this is where you're saying about leveling up. If they come in with unique skill sets about how to really harness AI, they actually can contribute right out of the gate in a slightly different way and then pick up the other sector specific skills as they go along contributing.
Yeah, I agree. And I love that you said the human in the loop part because that's where I saw my first ownership of a process as a junior employee within a company. I started off doing decks, like taking meeting notes and creating presentations. That was what I
Mhm.
did. And my management team redlined the heck out of that. And I learned from that. I
Yeah.
learned, wordsmithing for lack of a better word, and I learned how to, have this like executive appeal to my presentations. But now, if, simply put, if AI is taking that task, that responsibility, that human in the loop is now responsible for cultivating, packaging, reviewing for accuracy. And so that particular exercise has been leveled up. And now that person is responsible for managing the delegation of that task to AI and providing that oversight. And so I think it's just this like flow where we're going to look at things from a task level instead of role. It's going to be task specific, and things are going to be, infused or integrated with AI components. But those tasks still need management, still need oversight, still need nurturing and maybe even strategy and developing how they grow and they build from there.
Yeah, I can see an entirely separate conversation kind of spinning off from here too. I'm thinking you mentioned managing AI, and it's management skills without the soft skills that go with the interpersonal aspect of actually, being the manager of a human, which, on one hand makes it an easier job, on another, you don't develop those soft skills when you eventually do manage humans. So another angle, like I say, we could go on forever on this one, and maybe we will. Maybe we'll do another one
Another part two.
on one of these drill downs. Laura, if people want to find out more about the best, okay, hold on. I almost said find out more about the best innovation group. Laura, if people want to find out more about the Georgia FinTech Academy, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, I would check out our website, georgiafintechacademy.org, or follow us on LinkedIn at Georgia FinTech Academy. We also have content out on YouTube. So if you just search Georgia FinTech Academy on YouTube, we've been posting videos and content for our students as well. But please engage with us. We have plenty of opportunities to volunteer if you're a professional and looking to give back for students. No matter, where you come from, we have events that are open to the public on our website. We have some events that are restricted to USG, but for the most part, a lot of what we do on behalf of, creating opportunities for next gen talent is out there, and it's on our website.
And that's both in person here in Atlanta as well as remote. Well, obviously, you deal with, as you said before, a 25 university network, several of which are within, more than several hours drive. So these are all remote.
Yes, that's
So
correct.
they're
Most
all
most of them remote. I would say a small fraction of them in person.
right. Laura Gibson-Lamothe, the executive director of the Georgia FinTech Academy. Really enjoyed the conversation. Let's do another.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Agreed.
Hopefully next year I'll make it out to Amsterdam. I know I'll be out at Money 2020 US in Las Vegas in October, and that's always quite a to-do. But something tells me that we'll run through a couple more cycles between now and then before we see exactly what the hottest topics will be. And I'm sure stablecoin will be a big one in there. I'm sure AI will be a big one. And there's probably a fair bit of road ahead on both of those in terms of the way the winds keep shifting. The way both of those are both addressed and the attitudes toward them. So as always, looking forward to that. And thanks to Laura for giving this kind of an on-the-scenes update. With that, another episode of the Big Cast in the books. Again, my name is Glen Sarvati. You can check me out on LinkedIn and my firm, 154 Advisors, as well. You can find the Best Innovation Group out on LinkedIn as well at Big Fintech. Our Grand Poobah, John Best, at JB Fintech. And of course, as I said before, at the Best Innovation Group website, big-fintech.com. We've got new content here on the Big Cast every week. We'll have some new stuff again next week. Go to the media tab. You'll find past episodes. You'll find upcoming episodes. If you're not checking us out there, you can try us at any place you typically get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, etc. Check out the show notes. We've got information that ties you to some of the things we talked about, including, as I mentioned, the stablecoin approach that the UK is taking, the Georgia FinTech Academy, the blog we did about interchange regulation, etc. And next week, we've got another great interview set up on one of my favorite topics that always, to me, is central to pretty much everything that goes on in the payment space, trust, and some really good data that kind of disaggregates exactly where that trust is headed. Until then, hope you join us. Like us, subscribe to us, whatever you do at your podcast platform of choice, or just check out the website again, big-fintech.com next week, and you will find some very trustworthy information. Until then, thanks as always for listening.
Check back each week for the latest from the Big Cast. Or better yet, we hope you'll consider subscribing for free via Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Tweet us at Big Fintech, email info@big-fintech.com, or visit us at big-fintech.com and click on the Media tab, where you can post a comment or check out our archive of hundreds of past episodes. See you next week.